Good afternoon. I'm Professor Shane Dark, and welcome to our weekly NDART webinar broadcast, as always, from the ballrooms of Mars. Now, look, while we are widely dispersed, we acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, the work that's going to be presented today, I think, is of major importance, and I think it also demonstrates the breadth of research that's conducted at the centre. I'm delighted today to present George Economidis, who's going to be presenting on, as you can see, on looking at evidence-based programs to improve outcomes for high-risk families in New South Wales. This is from their Futures Matter project, which George is the trial coordinator. Now, George has worked with us since 2018. He has a background in psychology, and he's currently, for his sins, in the second year of his PhD. In this seminar, George will explore the nature and therapeutic approach of two family-based programs, as you can see, the multi-systemic therapy for child abuse and neglect and functional family therapy, child welfare. These are both programs designed to reduce the number of children who go into out-of-home care and the number of child maltreatment reports to the Department of Community and Justice. Now, of course, there is a link with the work of the Centre more broadly in substance dependence, in that drug and alcohol problems and indeed mental health problems are two of the major predictors of child maltreatment. Now, I'm delighted to also say that we'll be joined in question time by Professor Anthony Shakeshaft, who's one of our deputy directors here at NDART. And as well as being involved in this particular work, Anthony's got a long history in the evaluation of community intervention, so be well placed to share his expertise and observations. You can log in your questions at any time on the Q&A Zoom function. Please not chat on the Q&A function, so we've got them all in the one place. I'll relay to the speakers at the conclusion of the presentation. I may not be able to ask all of them, but I'll most certainly do my best. And having said all that, now, George, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Shane. By way of background, in 2015, an independent commission into out-of-home care was undertaken by David Tune. And the outcome or the consequences of that review found that although the New South Wales Child Protective Services, otherwise known as the Department of Communities and Justice, although they respond adequately in times of crisis when child maltreatment occurs in the family home, there was more of an opportunity to invest further resources and funding into early intervention services. So with that, the New South Wales government invested heavily into two community-based family therapy programs that originated in the United States, which will comprise the bulk of my talk today. So they are Functional Family Therapy Child Welfare, or FFTCW for short, and Multi-Systemic Therapy for Child Abuse and Neglect, or MST-CAN for short. NDART was independently contracted to undertake a three-stage evaluation of these two programs, which initiated their rollout in New South Wales in August 2017. So we conducted a process evaluation to begin with, which was understanding the adaptation and implementation of the two programs in the New South Wales context. Then we undertook an interim outcomes report, and then this presentation is the product of our final evaluation, which sort of brings together the outcomes from the findings from these process outcomes and economics evaluations. So that'll be what I'll be presenting today. So I'd just like to give thanks and to the evaluation team who I've worked with over the course of the last 3 years. So Professor Anthony Shakeshaft, who's the project lead in this evaluation, Professors Kate Diest and Chris Oldmeadow, who are the lead biostatisticians in this project, Dr. Darman Tran and Professor Chris Doran, who are the lead economists, and Miss Wendy Jobson and Dr. Sarah Farnbach, who were the qualitative leads and provided their expertise for the interviews and qualitative analyses in these evaluations. So If we think about the broad overview of programs that are delivered within a public health framework, at least in New South Wales, we can see that it sort of follows this trajectory. So programs are specifically tailored to address child maltreatment concerns across any of these domains. So DCJ and Their Futures Matter have invested in programs to increase rates of family preservation and restoration where possible, and optimize child and young people's experiences of out-of-home care. So if we see the gamut of programs that are offered by Their Futures Matter and DCJ, Brighter Futures, Safe Care, FFTCW and MST-CAN and Our Space, we can see that FFTCW and MST-CAN fall into the space of programs to preserve or restore families. A bit more explanation about what these programs actually are. So FFTCW is based on functional family therapy, which is a family therapy that arose in the sort of juvenile justice context in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, mainly for children who have behavioral problems, such as internalizing and externalizing behaviors. It addresses specific reasons for referral and risk and protective factors. And importantly, it includes two streams, a high track and a low track stream. So I'll go through each of these streams. So the high track stream has 5 specific stages. So the first 2 stages focus squarely on sort of instilling therapeutic rapport between family and therapist. So that's the engagement and motivation phase. Then relatedness sort of fosters the idea of understanding the family dynamic, interrelated and interaction patterns between family members. And then behavioral changes where therapeutic intervention is really injected, be it CBT, motivational interviewing, whatnot. Those types of treatments are tailored to the family needs. And then generalization involves what is learnt in treatment to then be maintained beyond the 6 to 9 months in which FFT is offered. The low track stream is a sort of condensed version of high track. It doesn't involve a specific therapeutic element. It's more of a case management role. It includes an engagement and motivation phase to similarly foster rapport between therapist and family, but it's more to do with support and monitoring. So referring families onto relevant services to, for example, assist with housing needs, employment, vocational education, that sort of thing. But like high track, it also has a generalization phase where what is learnt is expected to be maintained beyond just the 6 to 9 months that the program is offered. MST-CAN, so similarly to FFT, this also arose from a juvenile justice context in the 1970s and 80s, which was known as standard multisystemic therapy. It has a specific focus on harmonizing family relations, so the safety and welfare of the child is the primary aim. It's actually a 24/7 service, so it is very intensely therapeutic in terms of what's offered to families. It's specifically for families with complex needs, so those with child abuse and neglect. And as we know, the 3 main drivers of child abuse and neglect that MST-CAN tries to really focus on is poor mental health, low socioeconomic circumstances, and drug and alcohol issues. It's specifically for families who have not previously benefited from community interventions, offered by DCJ or not. And it recruits a bioecological framework. So the idea that the family and the child exist within an interrelated system. So the parent is seen as the system that is most proximately close to the child, so can therefore instill the greatest amount of change. And then that change is expected to have a sort of ripple effect. So it systematically works across domains that the family operates. So the home, the school, places of employment, that sort of thing. So the eligibility criteria for the 2 programs. So both programs are for children and young people. For FFT, that's all children and young people, 0 to 17 years, whereas for MST-CAN, it's for 6 to 17 years. The child or young person has to reside in family care, or they can reside in out-of-home care, but there has to be a plan to restore the child to the family home within 4 to 6 weeks for FFTCW, or 6 to 8 weeks for MST-CAN. For MST-CAN, there has to be a Roche report, and I'll explain what a Roche report is in a little while, but essentially when a child is suspected of being of imminent risk, a contact is made to Child Protective Services, and that essentially forms a Roche. it stands for risk of significant harm. So that ROSH has to have been completed within 180 days of notification. And then in terms of actual risk, for MST-CAN, it's quite restrictive in terms of having children who are at very high risk of child abuse. So for their risk assessment is high or very high, but the child has to be safe or safe with a plan. For FFTCW, they used to have this eligibility criteria, but then this was relaxed. So they only really had to have a safety and risk assessment completed. So potentially from March 2019, the program was open to children of low, medium, and high risk. No active sexual abuse as an eligibility criteria, and 50% of places to both FFT and MST were prescribed or for Aboriginal families, given they are disproportionately overrepresented in many aspects of the criminal justice and child maltreatment systems. So by way of example, I can just explain briefly how a child might come into contact with the FFTCW program here, to use as an example. So a report is made by a community member or a mandatory reporter about a child being a potential risk of harm. So this is akin to the ROSH that I explained in the previous slide, the risk of significant harm. That ROSH report then is attended to by a DCJ via a helpline assessment. If that meets a particular threshold of risk using their script tool, then they'll respond to that either within 24 hours, 72 hours, or 10 days. They'll do that by allocating a caseworker. So that person, a caseworker who usually works for DCJ, then goes to the family home and they will substantiate or verify the extent to which there is a risk of significant harm by conducting a safety assessment. So we can see that if the child is deemed unsafe, they're removed from home. They're not eligible unless there is a plan, like I said, to restore the child within 4 weeks. And if they're safe with a plan or safe, then they are potentially eligible for the FFTCW program, pending that there is a vacancy at a particular service and a particular location that's offering the program. So that's how a child might come into contact with the FFTCW program. So without laboring the exact numbers, I just thought I'd give you an overview about how, what sort of data sets and databases we use to obtain the numbers for our outcomes evaluation. So we define the period of interest as being the commencement of the program. So that's the 1st of August 2017 to the 31st of December 2018. So that gives us a 12-month post-program observation window to see the outcomes of children up until the 31st of December 2019. So we use data from child protection helpline contacts, so where people report risk of significant harm, program referrals, so that's the number of families that are actually in the FFTCW and MST-CAN program, then how many of those program referrals can be linked to child protection and out-of-home care databases, and then we apply the eligibility criteria that I'll explain in the next slide to program referrals who are potentially eligible for this evaluation. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but in terms of the application of the eligibility criteria, we can see that we actually started off with quite a lot of data. So we had almost 300,000 child protection records and over 1,300 referrals to both the FFTCW and MST-CAN programs. And then when we applied the eligibility criteria that I explained in the previous slides, we can see that the numbers sort of whittled down, and that ultimately, after we applied each of these eligibility criteria, we had just over 8,000 child protection data records that were eligible and 320 referrals, or 316 if we take away the 4 families for whom we couldn't allocate FFTCW high track or FFTCW low track. And if we break that down even further, of 316 families, we can see that 224 families were eligible in FFT high track, 63 in low track, and 29 in MST-CAN. About 3/4 accepted a place in the program across across FFTCW and MST-CAN. So, and to be accepted in the program, it means that either the service provider or the family did not decline participation or engagement in the program for any reason. Early exit or withdrawals, that's about 1/3 to 40% across the programs, and early exit and withdrawals can be for any number of reasons, be it the child has been removed into out-of-home care, or the family could no longer be contacted, or that they've moved in a geographical location that's beyond where the program is being delivered. And then we can see completion rates across the programs being 72% for FFT high track, just over 50% for FFT low track and MST CAN. So we looked at two primary outcomes of interest. So our primary outcomes of interest were out of home care, so whether the child was removed from the biological home, and Rotary report, so whether there was a report of child maltreatment that was made by a mandatory reporter or a community member to the Child Protection Helpline. So we compared FFT-CW and MST-CAN to two comparison groups. So the two comparison groups are whether the family was in the same district as where the program was being delivered, but they weren't actually referred to the FFT-CW and MST-CAN program, and whether they were in a different district where the program was being delivered. We looked at unadjusted and adjusted rates, but given their similarity and for sake of consistency and clarity, we've just reported on the adjusted percentages here. So the adjusted just means that we adjusted for correlation of outcomes within districts, so where the programs are actually being delivered, their locations. So we can see that for the first primary outcome, being out of home care entry within 12 months for families who were referred and completed the FFT-CW and MST-CAN programs, we can see that the outcome so far is quite good. So for 120 families, for example, only one family went into out of home care for FFT-CW high track. Of 23 families who were eligible, who referred and completed the FFT-CW low track program, one family went into out of home care, and no families for MST-CAN. And granted, these numbers are quite small. If we look at the wall test, the p-values, this effect is both significant for FFT high track and low track, but I would sort of take that with a grain of salt, given the very small numbers of families that we included in this evaluation. But what's more promising is if we look at the ratios and the 95% confidence intervals, we can see that this effect is indeed significant so far for FFT-CW high track. So for example, the odds of a child going into out of home care is 14.3 times lower if they completed FFT high track than if they were in the same district as the program, but they weren't referred to it, or almost 11 times lower compared to if they were in a different district where the program was being delivered. But we can't substantiate those claims just yet because those, we need more numbers, obviously, and these are not statistically significant so far for the FFT-CW low track and MST-CAN programs. So our second outcome of interest was Rotary reports within 12 months. So again, this is for families who were referred to and who completed the programs. We can see that the numbers here are a little bit more, there is a bit more similarity between groups across the three conditions. Again, if we use significance here, the only statistically significant difference here is for families who referred and completed the FFT-CW high track program compared to families who are in a different district to where the FFT-CW high track program was being delivered. So families who referred and completed the FFT-CW high track program had almost 2 times, the odds of having a Roche report within 12 months is almost 2 times lower if they completed the FFT-CW high track program in full compared to if they were in a different district to where FFT-CW high track was being delivered. So we also conducted secondary analyses for early exiters. We wanted to see whether outcomes were differentially impacted depending on whether the family completed the program in full or whether they withdrew early from the program for any reason that I explained earlier. So whether they moved to a different area, whether they couldn't be contacted. So we can actually see the inverse here so far. We can actually see that there is sort of, more detrimental outcomes for families who withdraw early from the program compared to the two comparison groups. And this requires further unpacking. That's sort of beyond the scope of this project so far, but I thought I'd just bring it to your attention. So we can see, for example, of 46 families who withdrew early, for example, from FFT high track, a third went into out of home care. And those rates are quite similar across programs. So 20% of families who withdrew early from low track went into out-of-home care, as did 20% of families in MST CAN. And we can see that, again, this is only significant for FFTCW high track. So the odds are, between 0.2 and 0.3 times higher, the odds of going into out-of-home care if they withdrew early from FFT high track, for example, compared to the other two comparison groups. I know I haven't spent a whole lot of time speaking about the FFTCW low track and MST CAN results, but you can see here that the numbers are very, very small. So, of 8 families, we're talking about 2 families that have gone into out-of-home or gotten into out-of-home care for MST CAN, 4 families for FFTCW low track. So this is something, this is sort of impetus for further investment in these sorts of programs. And then finally, we also had a secondary analysis for people who exited early from the program in terms of their Roche within 12 months. Similarly to people who completed the program in full, except this time, families had a higher percentage of Roche reports if they left early from either the FFTCW or MST CAN program compared to the 2 relative comparison groups, but this was not significant across any of the conditions. Okay, so beyond my domain, but the economics analysis for this project. So these are the various components that we integrated in our cost benefit ratio. So we included the cost to deliver the program. So we can see that they are very expensive programs to actually run, $30 million for FFT high track, approximately half of that for MST CAN, and just over $5 million for FFT low track. Of particular interest might be the average cost per family. So we can see that it's about $30,000 per unit cost for a family to engage with the program in full, and over $110,000, or almost $110,000 for MST CAN. There are a number of reasons for that: the 24/7 nature of the program, the fact that there's a part-time psychiatrist that works alongside. And then we also included the outcomes that we looked at. So, number of out-of-home care places avoided, the savings from an out-of-home care, the number of Roche reports avoided, and the savings from avoided Roche reports. So we can see, if we look at the cost-benefit ratios here, so a cost-benefit ratio of 1 would mean that essentially they break even, and anything beyond 1 would mean benefits exceed the costs. So we can see for FFTCW high track and FFTCW low track that the cost benefit, or the BCR, is approaching 1, but for MST CAN, it's 0.11, it's a long way off. So we'll unpack that a little bit further. So if we look at the average cost of FFTCW over time, we can see that the cost is reducing over time. We can see that, in the early period, in the 2017 and early 2018 period, we can see that the average cost of both programs was actually quite high. And that's obviously because there are a number of startup costs associated with the initial pre-implementation and rollout of the 2 programs in New South Wales. But we can actually see that over time that this startup cost is actually being washed out to the point where, the 2 programs are actually converging over time in terms of their average cost. So the BCR of FFTCW, so we can see that the benefit cost ratio for the 2 programs are going up at the same time the percentage of reduction in the unit cost is going down. And we actually estimate that for a BCR of 1, so again, the break-even situation, will be obtained for FFT low track when the average unit cost is reduced by 20%, and for FFTCW high track when the average cost is reduced by 40%. We can also see the average cost of MST CAN by time. The figure is showing that the average cost of MST CAN is falling over time, but relative to the other 2, relative to FFTCW, but the average cost of MST CAN still remains quite high. Even from the 2017 to 18 period to the middle of 2019, it's a difference of about $6,000, $67,000 to $61,000. So the program does remain quite high and expensive to run. And the benefit cost ratio for MST CAN nonetheless is still increasing as the average cost for all 3 programs is decreasing. So that is a similar trend across both the FFTCW and MST CAN programs. So we also, as part of this evaluation, conducted a qualitative analysis where we interviewed families who engaged with the program in either withdrew from the program or completed the program in its entirety. So as you can see that previously that there were quite a few families who did complete the program, but we only managed to successfully interview 6 families for a number of reasons, difficult to contact, and there were also confidentiality issues associated with interviewing families who withdrew early. So ultimately, we interviewed 6 families who successfully completed FFTCW high track and 1 family who successfully completed FFTCW low track. We also interviewed district directors. So these are people for whom who have general oversight of the MST CAN and FFTCW programs. So people who are involved in the implementation, adaptation, and delivery of the programs in their respective geographical catchment, for example. And they include caseworkers, directors, manager of client services, and executive directors. So what were the findings from these interviews? So if we look at enablers, so these were semi-structured interviews. So if we look at enablers from the perspectives of families, so again, this is FFTCW only because we were only able to interview families who completed the FFTCW program. So families were extremely positive about the individualized and tailored approach of the programs in improving a wide variety of skills, especially enhancing communication interaction between family members. So they really praised the tailored and person-centered approach of the programs as key features underpinning their high levels of engagement, particularly in terms of greater insight into adverse child rearing practices or empowering families through psychoeducation, and also collaboratively teaching carers how to manage their own anxieties, for example, when dealing with stressful situations in the family home. Things like not being responsive to feedback and how to address children who are exhibiting externalizing behaviors, that sort of thing. And they also really positively express the flexibility in the delivery of the program. So the program being provided in the family home in a context of comfort and familiarity to the families, sometimes being flexible in terms of the time and dates in which therapy can be provided. And also the idea about, families controlling their own sort of narrative. They have the agency and the autonomy to sort of dictate how therapy is run, and also the types of members who they deem important in their family nucleus. So beyond just mum and dad, it can also include uncles, aunties, grandparents. And also they really like the idea that, delivery is respectful and understanding. So it's not about apportioning blame or anything like that to family members to, incite stigma or anything like that. It's about changing interaction patterns between family members. From the director's point of view, they also really enjoyed the therapeutic and outcomes-driven nature of the program. So the idea that they were very strengths-based and focusing on family empowerment and agency. The idea that the models are a dual focus on therapy and case management. So they're sort of a blend of both therapeutic intervention, but also helping families in their day-to-day affairs and reducing child harm and improving child safety. So harking back to the out-of-home care and Rotary report outcome data that I presented earlier. The directors also positively emphasised the engagement and retention strategies of the program. So the strong alliance between families and the therapeutic team. If you think back to the engagement and motivation phases of the programs, that idea about building rapport between therapist and family was sort of really key to getting families across that 9-month period. And also monitoring and fidelity systems. So the idea about being able to track where families are in the program at any one stage, whether they withdrew early, whether they're currently active in the program, whether they completed the program, but also, fidelity systems in terms of ensuring that supervisors, therapists are well supervised and there is a strong fidelity and quality assurance mechanism in place. In terms of potential barriers, these are quite nuanced. But from the perspectives of families, the idea is that therapists may lack broader knowledge and skills in complex family issues. These might include psychosocial and physical child harms like attachment issues and the effects of malnutrition. And the idea that the programs might be too time-bound in the sense that it's very difficult to extend beyond the 6 to 9 months that the programs are initially mandated for, and at times not utilising Aboriginal support workers as effectively as may be. From the perspective of directors, the idea that at times there may have been inconsistent communication between services delivering FFTCW and MST CAN and both the commissioning body and DCJ. The idea that some therapists may not demonstrate an awareness of Aboriginal customs and values, contingent on any sorts of circumstances that they see in the family home. And one of the big issues that came across in both programs was staffing issues, particularly around recruitment and turnover, because it's quite difficult with these tertiary qualifications that are in place, sort of people with masters of counselling, clinical psychologists, to recruit people in remote or rural areas that are delivering the programs. So I just thought I'd also show the process data to show how many families actually, engage with the programs at some stage. So, we can see that we could only use a select number of this in our outcomes evaluation because we essentially retrofitted the eligibility criteria to whittle the numbers down. But I just wanted to show you the number of families who withdrew, completed, or were currently active in the programs between August 2017 and 31st of December 2019 across the programs. So we can see about a quarter to a third of families withdrew from FFTCW or MST CAN, and the same sort of trend for Aboriginal families. Almost 50% of families have completed the program in some either FFT high track, low track, or MST CAN, and there are about a quarter to a third of families who are still active in the program. So they haven't withdrawn, they haven't completed in the program, they're just essentially still receiving the service. So in terms of overall conclusions that we can draw from the evaluation so far, so the idea of whether FFTCW and MST can actually work in New South Wales. So there are three questions that we wanted to answer about impact. So does it look like there is an impact? Is the size of the impact meaningful, statistically and practically? And can we confidently attribute the impact to the programs? So for all three programs, it does look like that there is an impact on the primary outcomes, and the impact is in the expected direction. So as I presented in the earlier data, for families, especially for those who completed the program in full, it looks like that there is a positive effect in terms of reducing the rates at which children go into out-of-home care and who have incidences of child maltreatment against them. At this stage, those sorts of effects are only statistically significant for FFTCW high track and low track. But again, to reiterate as a sort of caveat, the sample sizes are very small. So it's too early to say whether these effects are indeed sort of attributable to the programs themselves or something else. But it does sort of give merit to, the ongoing funding and evaluation of the programs, at least to see, what the outcomes are for, the 1,300 families or whatnot that have come into contact with the program up until the end of 2019. So in terms of, are the impacts practically meaningful? So the qualitative data that I presented from the families and district directors are emphatically supportive. So, they really like the strengths-based therapeutic elements of both programs, the fact that, there is the focus on family autonomy and empowerment, and, the high level of engagement and support that families are given throughout the programs. The barriers were quite nuanced, but nonetheless, they do require further unpacking, but it's a bit hard given the small number of families and directors that we interviewed, like the interaction between therapies and complex child neglect issues like attachment and malnutrition. And in terms of, can we confidently attribute the impact to the programs? So, usually this is dealt by the evaluation design. So this is not an RCT. We sort of came on retrospectively while the programs had already been delivered, and while and during the programs have already been delivered in New South Wales. So our design is retrospective. So there are likely to be differences between children and young people in the intervention and the control groups other than the programs. But any sort of systematic differences that might affect outcomes, you would hope might be sort of washed out, with more families that come into the program, especially, if the numbers are, 1,300 at 2019, we're in 2021 now and the programs are still rolling. So it'd be interesting to sort of evaluate those outcomes on a more longitudinal basis. In terms of the economic costs and benefits of the program, so at present, and I'm a bit wary to talk about this, but given the economics data and the small number of families and the limited sort of range of outcomes and benefits that we looked at, but in our evaluation at present, they all cost more than the benefits, so their CBR is less than 1. It seems plausible that the FFTCW, both the low track and the high track streams, will reach a cost benefit ratio of 1. But MST-CAN is quite a while off. I think it was 0.11. So using this economic metric, it doesn't look as though it'll reach a CBR of 1, but that doesn't mean that the program is less effective than the other programs. It just really speaks to the fact that the program is so expensive to deliver. If you remember, it costs almost $110,000 for one family who engages with the MST-CAN program. A CBR of 1 is sometimes an unnecessarily high bar, and it might not necessarily be the greatest sort of metric in terms of the effectiveness of a program, but nonetheless, there are strategies to improve the cost benefit ratio, like reducing the costs of delivering. Like I explained earlier, the setup costs were quite high, and we can see those costs diminish over time. They're starting to dissipate as the average cost to deliver the programs is reducing over time. And there are benefits beyond just out-of-home care and Roche data. It'd be interesting, and I believe this has already been conducted, that linking across multiple data sets to investigate things like completion rates at school, or avoidance of crime, or avoidance of accidents and emergencies. So seeing things from a more pragmatic perspective, because the jury's sort of out about whether out-of-home care and Roche reports are the best sort of outcomes for family therapy. But looking into sort of additional outcome metrics might be something worth looking at. So in terms of recommendations, so the report has some specific recommendations about the ongoing implementation of the programs. So there's enough evidence at this stage to unequivocally conclude that the program should be continued. Like I said, there are small numbers. We can't conclude so far, that there isn't an effect, that there is or there isn't an effect. We just need more families to essentially be eligible for the program, and which means more families to enter the program. One possible thing to look at is to establish a threshold rate of acceptance or withdrawal. One possible threshold might be 75%, and then work out what is happening if it drops below that. So what are the characteristics, for example, of families that are withdrawing early from the program? Is there some sort of consistent pattern that we can see in families who withdraw early, and what can we do then to support those families? We can revisit the data that's being collected. So at present, therapists are administering self-report sort of psychometric surveys, like the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire and Personal Wellbeing Index. We couldn't include that data in this evaluation so far because there was a change from 6 measures to 2, and the data was quite patchy. There were different family members who were completing these metrics at baseline and at follow-up, so we couldn't necessarily get a comparison there, and at times they weren't being administered. And I think probably of very high importance is the idea to monitor processes and outcomes in real time and continuously, so not intermittently or too late. So if we monitor processes and outcomes, we can see sort of in real time families, we can sort of track families who are through the programs, and we can also better align eligibility criteria for high-risk families for any number of the programs that are offered by DCJ for families who have differing risk profiles. So we can better tailor programs to family needs. So even beyond FFTCW and MST-CAN, there are other programs, Brighter Futures, that are offered in the New South Wales context that might be better aligned, for example, to a family risk profile. So I just thought I'd conclude by saying thank you to everyone who was involved. It was an enormously complicated undertaking, and at least from the present preliminary data, we can be optimistic that fewer children and young people are having to enter out-of-home care. Thanks.
Right, excellent. Thank you very much, George. And Anthony, come back. George, if we can get you to stop sharing screen.
Sure.
I'm not allowed to touch that button, as you know, under threat of death. Look, that was just an excellent presentation, and the work is just so important. And I congratulate you and the team. I particularly like the multiple arms, the mixed methods. It gives you just such a rich picture of complex programs. But before we go to questions, I'm just going to get Anthony, if you have any observations you'd like to make upon George's presentation, or indeed the study and programs generally.
Yeah, thanks, Shane, and thanks, George. That was a great presentation. I might just pick up a little bit for a couple of minutes on George's last sort of final few comments there, just about the enormity of the task. Because I think one of the unique things about this project was the combination of people that were involved to make it happen. So it's, as researchers, we're used to kind of sitting in our offices and doing, controlling what happens and being able to measure things perfectly. But in this case, it's a real example of working with a wide range of people. So there's, the minister's breathing down everybody's neck because it's cost a lot of money. So he or she wants to know, does it work?
Yeah.
There's people within the department, there's senior people who have got responsibility for rolling out the program. There's the NGO service providers who are actually delivering it on the ground. And then there's researchers, and all of us, in this case, it was NDUC. So all of us kind of want something slightly different. The minister wants to know, does it work and what does it cost?
Yeah.
We want to be able to publish things in the peer-reviewed literature. The NGO people just want to know, how can they refine and modify the program to make it more effective or more acceptable to more families. So, you're working in a really intense environment, and there was a lot of pressure there. And of course, it's all got to be done in 12 or 18 months. So, so I think that that's quite a unique model, and I think to have come out the other end of it with something where we can make some fairly robust statements based on what is really methodologically good quality data. As George said, if we'd been involved earlier, we would love to have done a randomised trial. But, a sort of observational study, with two different comparison groups taking into account, the clustering effect within districts, all of that, I think, really points to, a really high quality piece of work that genuinely came out of, having to work around the different expectations and the different needs of different key stakeholders. And I think, if nothing else, this project really shows that it can be done. And it might be worth noting, George also, mentioned about it'd be great to kind of have another go at the evaluation now that there's more families been through the program. And we've worked closely with Department of Communities and Justice, in particular FAXIA, which is the evaluation arm of what used to be FACS. And they've essentially developed their own model so that they can evaluate outcomes in real time. So as families finish, they can much more quickly. And that's really based on our model. So we worked a lot with them about handing over what we've done, how we evaluated, how we built our model. So it's a really nice example of, I think universities engaging in the real world to take what we know, which is, I virtually knew nothing about child protection when we started this. I've learned a lot, but we know how to do evaluation. So it's combining the sort of expertise and skills of the people who know how to roll out those programs, with evaluation and research teams like NDUC. And as I say, I think it's a really nice example of that.
Yeah, I concur. I think it's an excellent example of translational research. And the fact that you're right, all those points are well made, Anthony. We see results and we forget just how complex this is. I've got a question. I'll throw it to you first, George, and then I might get Anthony's viewpoint. And it's from Mark. It says, in your opinion, there is an argument for continuing the program, and I think we partly addressed this, if the cost-benefit ratio cannot be increased to 1 or above, or should they be discontinued if costs cannot be reduced? So, I mean, this comes into the issues I think we've spoken before of where do costs sit in the broad spectrum of what outcomes are and what the benefits are. So, George, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I don't think the program should be discontinued just because a cost-benefit ratio doesn't reach 1. I mean, if, for example, we're seeing, if the trends continue the way they are in terms of families who are, children who avoid going into out-of-home care or who avoid having a Roche report, for example, and if that, the number of families who avoid those negative outcomes increase, but you get a cost-benefit ratio of 0.89, it's sort of difficult to justify discontinuing the programs if you're seeing a positive effect, just because it might not be economically feasible from this one sort of economic analysis, being this cost benefit ratio. And I think it's just important to note as well that that cost benefit ratio, at least for FFTCW, it looks like it might reach one as well if we're using or at least with more families who go through the program. So I think at this stage it's just too early to, substantiate conclusions just on the cost benefit ratio alone. And there might be additional outcomes and benefits that we look at with linked
George,
data.
you also pointed out that you're looking at 12-month follow-up.
Yeah.
And the benefits of a program like this could extend across decades potentially.
Yes.
Anthony, I know it's an issue that you're very interested in. Do you have a view?
No, just always remember that a cost benefit ratio is a combination of costs and benefits. And I think if there was no benefit, then we'd have a problem. But because this is showing that both these programs are showing promising signs that there is a benefit, then I think it's worth persisting with.
Just pursuant to this, I mean, I agree. I mean, if you look at the issue of drug treatments, they're expensive in many cases, and they have to extend over a long time, but the long-term benefits are substantial. And I think we've always got to look at the moral imperative of the individual cases that you're dealing with. I've got a question here from Don Weatherburn under one of his pseudonyms, N2N2UMV. I think it's motor vessel Weatherburn. And I'd ask this to George. It's a health economics question. So it's just said why cost benefit ratio rather than cost effectiveness. I mean, this is two different types of measures, but George, did you choose cost benefits for a reason rather than cost effectiveness?
So I think we actually did do a cost effectiveness analysis as well, but it's their Futures Matter had established. Well, I think what they wanted to do was they wanted a standardized approach that they could use across many of their interventions. And I remember one of the specifications beforehand for their economic analysis was a cost benefit analysis.
So you've got a single unit you can measure out. You've got a single measure of outcome you can measure.
Yeah. Is that right, Anthony? That you remember as well? Yeah.
Got a question from Alyssa Harwood. And George, did you get a sense from the Department of Communities and Justice if they expected the sort of throughput that you experienced with the whole numbers? Or do you think they were expecting a number closer to the 8,000 children who are eligible for the program?
I think initially there was a sort of bit of confusion as to why we got the numbers we did. It's essentially in terms of the number of families who were eligible for this evaluation.
Yeah.
So I don't think 8,000 was the expectation, but they probably expected more than the 300 odd that we had included in our analysis. But I think after we justified the number of families who were excluded each of those stages by retrofitting sort of the eligibility criteria, it made a lot more sense. And that was why we also looked at then the secondary analysis in terms of families who withdrew early, just to see if there was a different impact, because the numbers were lower than what was expected, perhaps not 8,000, but probably lower than what was expected by DCJ. Yeah.
Anthony, did you have any observations?
Oh, just to probably add that it also, I think, reflects the kind of real world nature of what's happening. It was always going to take time to train up the staff in how to deliver it, to recruit them, and for them to get better at, the NGOs to get kind of more efficient at establishing their systems to deliver the program. So, I think it was always going to be a bit of a slow burn to start with.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, the real world is always like that in any area we work in. It seemed to me, getting back to that issue of early dropout, shall we say, that longer retention, I'm going to draw a parallel with drug treatment programs. One of the things we found over the years, for instance, on opioid treatment, is what's called a longer dose of treatment. I don't mean methadone or bupropion. I mean longer enrolment in the treatment over fewer episodes, like stable long-term treatment in the drug field. Are we seeing a similar thing here, where a longer engagement with an enrolment in a program is, even if it is more expensive, is more beneficial? Is that what, because it looked to me like the early dropouts were suggesting that, George.
Yeah, so these programs were actually extended for by 3 months from their initial standardized format. So initially they were approximately 4 months, but now they're 6 to 9 months. So one of the issues we had in terms of our economic analysis was we didn't necessarily have we didn't have access to the date in which a family had exactly left the program. So it was difficult to make that, to do an economic analysis as a proportion to dropout rate, essentially, or period of dropout. So that is something that, needs sort of unpacking in the future, I think, as well. But I think the general trend is that, and obviously we need to verify this with further data, that, the longer because the retention and the engagement strategies were so positively expressed, at least from a qualitative point of view, and there are quality assurance mechanisms that the services have in place. So I think we can assume that families who do sort of, who remain with the program for a longer period of time might have better outcomes, but that is something that requires further investigation, I think, and having the exact dates in which a family, starts a program, finishes a program, be it withdraw or complete, I think that would really help.
I think having the qual component of that is really important about finding the experience of people in, and it's interesting, a lot of now, Anthony, you would well know this, in RCTs now, which aren't the answer to everything, as we well know, but quite a lot of trials in our field build in a qual component, Anthony, don't they now, quite deliberately, because it provides some. Do you have any observations on how qual fitted it into all of this?
Yeah, I agree. I just try to answer that. I'd also add to the, it's a really interesting point about the retention, and I agree with George. We're not entirely sure about the period of retention, so we just need to be a bit careful. But the other note of caution I'd make is that we're really unsure about the cause-effect relationship there. So it could be that some families drop out because the kid goes into out-of-home care. And for others, it's the reverse. So, there's a bit more there we need to.
But it's something you'd like to explore, certainly, I would imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really critical question, and it's very, as you'd imagine, it's very high on the, in terms of interest for the, for the government, about whether some treatment imparts some benefit. And to answer the second bit, about the qualitative work, I just think it's really critical. Probably when I first started doing RCTs, I wasn't that interested in the contribution of qualitative research, but I've really shifted, over the
scales have fallen from your weary old eyes, Anthony.
Exactly. And I just think it really gives you insights into why something does or doesn't work. And equally importantly, how it can be improved in the next iteration. So, we can learn things from what people tell us, as long as we collect the data, in a structured, careful way, the qualitative data, we can then learn things about, what can we modify in a program to see if we can improve the cost-benefit ratio or some other outcome.
Yes. And George, with the qual stuff, I think it was a real advantage to look at both the families and the directors. And I was wondering if anything stood out to you, that were they picking up on different things, were they seeing different things, or did things come up that you didn't expect from one or the other?
I think it would have been nice or ideal to sort of have interviewed families who withdrew early as well, because I feel that it would have it might have painted a different picture about the programs, negative or positive. That would be worth exploring. I think overall, it was heartening to see that the families sort of echoed the same ideas of the directors in terms of the positive aspects of the program from a strengths-based and an empowerment perspective, that they sort of feel as though they have the agency to continue, adopting what they've learned in therapy beyond just the 6 months that the therapy has been delivered. So, and I just wanted to also say that, we also did some qualitative data early in 2018 for the first report, and some of the findings from that have actually been already integrated from a higher level, sort of their futures matter point of view. So those outcomes that we presented on earlier, so the self-report measures of the personal wellbeing index and the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. So there were initially actually 6 measures that therapists would have to administer to families at intake and program completion. And so a lot of the feedback from that was quite, it was quite overwhelming and it was quite burdensome and time consuming. So those measures ultimately reduced from 6 to 2 measures that, one focusing on the child, one focusing on the parent.
You've got to be realistic about
I think pragmatism came to the fore. So.
Yeah, as it should, as it inevitably does. Look, it's been outstanding. I'm really impressed by the program and the work you've done, George and Anthony and the whole team is just first class. I've got just a quick message here from John Howard, who's not the Prime Minister, but John Howard, who used to work at this centre. Well, I'm assuming that, but he's done a lot of work with youth and has said that thanks, George, for a neat presentation on a hugely complex intervention and over which you virtually had no control, which doesn't be not in the sense that it's, I think what he's saying is it's a true collaboration. You just didn't impose things. Fantastic effort, thoughtful and useful comments on your findings and best wishes for your future work. So
thanks, John. Appreciate it.
That's terrific. It's been outstanding. George, thank you for an outstanding presentation on a really important topic. Anthony, your wisdom as always is invaluable, and it's always great to get your view on and I know you pushed this for many years, and you're quite translational research and involving real world community research. It's been terrific. And for the audience out there, thank you for your questions, thank you for your attention, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your afternoon and evening. Thank you all.